In 1956, someone bothered to count the residents of Gulf Shores, Alabama, and arrived at the number 120. That same year, a carpenter's family opened a pink wooden bar on the beach, named it the Pink Pony Pub, and figured 120 people was probably enough of a customer base to keep the taps running. 70 years later, Gulf Shores welcomes 6.5 million visitors a year. They spend nearly $7 billion. The lodging revenue alone hit $923 million in 2025, more than double what it was a decade earlier. And in March of 2026, the Gulf Shores City Council voted unanimously to freeze new development for 12 months. Because if all the land currently entitled for construction actually got built, it would add 23,000 new units to a city that currently has about 12,000. Every major road would exceed capacity. The city's own planners used the word deficient. So here is the question that nobody in the tourism office wants to hear. What do you do when the thing people love about your town is being consumed by the fact that people love your town? Gulf Shores sits at the bottom of Alabama, the state's southernmost settlement, a sliver of white sand pinched between the Gulf of Mexico and a labyrinth of bays, lagoons, and waterways. For most of American history, it was one of the hardest places on the Gulf Coast to reach. The land behind the beach was dense forest and swamp. No railroad ever came. No highway connected it to anywhere that mattered. The only reliable way in was by boat, and the only reason to come was fish. The community that existed there before the 20th century was tight-knit in the way that isolation forces. Families in and around the tiny hamlet of Bon Secours, French for safe harbor, pulled shrimp and oysters from the warm Gulf waters and bartered more than they spent cash. Baldwin County, which contains Gulf Shores, had been organized as far back as 1809, but the coastline itself remained essentially wild. Fort Morgan, built in 1819, guarded the mouth of Mobile Bay and saw action during the Civil War, but the fort was a military installation, not a town. The sand on either side of it belonged to the herons and the wind. What changed everything, slowly, was water infrastructure. In 1937, the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway was completed, threading a navigable channel along the coast and suddenly making the Gulf Shores area reachable without fighting through miles of swamp. 2 years later, in 1939, the state of Alabama dedicated Gulf State Park, over 6,000 acres of coastline, freshwater lakes, and maritime forest. The park included 2 miles of white sand beach, and for the first time, there was an official reason for an outsider to come. A few fishing camps and modest cottages appeared along the shore, catering to families from Mobile and Birmingham who'd heard rumors of sand so white it squeaked underfoot, and water so warm you could wade in through October. The Pink Pony Pub arrived in the middle of this quiet era. The Calloway family had been running a handful of beachside rentals they called the Seahorse Cottages. A carpenter named Bruce Murnick's parents bought the property. When Bruce converted part of it into a bar and grill, his mother, Mary Bell, chose the name Pink Pony, keeping with the seaside animal theme, and painting the exterior a shade of pink that could charitably be described as aggressive. In 1956, Gulf Shores had no high-rises. It had no traffic lights. Beach Boulevard was mostly 2 lanes. You could drive the entire length of the coast and not see a building taller than 4 stories. The Pink Pony served cold beer and oysters on the half-shell 100 feet from the surf. And at night, the only light competition came from the stars. That same year, 120 residents petitioned to incorporate as a town. Other locals fought the effort, worried about taxes, and the dispute went all the way to the Alabama Supreme Court, which granted the incorporation in 1958. The city of Gulf Shores was born, 206 acres along the Intracoastal Canal, a name on a map and not much else. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, growth was gentle. A bridge over Perdido Pass in 1962 connected the Gulf Shores side to the Florida side. Gulf State Park expanded. An 825-foot saltwater fishing pier in 1968. a 468-site campground and golf course by 1972. The park built a beachside recreation hall that locals called the casino, not a gambling hall, but a gathering place where teenagers danced and civic groups held meetings. The first National Shrimp Festival was held in 1971. By the mid-70s, tourism was beginning to outpace the declining commercial fishing industry as the economic engine of the coast. But Gulf Shores still felt like a secret, the kind of beach you told friends about in a whisper, the kind of place where the tallest structure on the horizon was the State Park Pier. And then on the evening of September 12, 1979, it all went away. Hurricane Frederic made landfall at Dauphin Island as a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 130 miles per hour and a storm surge that reached 15 feet. Over 500,000 people evacuated from the central Gulf Coast, the largest coastal evacuation in American history up to that point. And that massive flight likely kept the death toll to 5. But Gulf Shores took the hit directly. 80% of the buildings in the city were destroyed. The Rolling Tides Hotel went out with the tide. Every beachfront motel was severely damaged or flattened. Most homes fronting Little Lagoon were gone. Alabama Highway 180, the road connecting Fort Morgan to Gulf Shores, was washed out in several places. The storm tide went completely across the narrow land between the beach and Mobile Bay, as if the Gulf had decided to remind everyone that this peninsula was borrowed territory. The damage across the region reached $2.3 billion, a record sum at the time. FEMA, barely a year old as an agency, directed nearly $250 million in aid to Alabama. An engineer surveying the aftermath estimated that 95% of the structures on the beach had received some degree of damage or had been destroyed outright. The Pink Pony Pub was among the casualties. Longtime patrons remembered drinking there the day before Frederic arrived, and then the storm, as one of them put it, blew it away. The little pink building, the oysters, the jukebox, gone. The beach it sat on was scoured down to hardpan. Here is where the story of Gulf Shores becomes the story that only Gulf Shores can tell. Because what happened next was not the slow decline that follows disaster in so many American coastal towns. What happened next was the opposite. Frederic didn't kill Gulf Shores. Frederic gave Gulf Shores permission to become something entirely new. The logic was brutally simple. Before the hurricane, Gulf Shores was a patchwork of modest cottages, family-owned motels, fish camps, and sand dunes. Most of it was wood frame. Most of it was 1 or 2 stories. And most of it was now matchsticks. The insurance claims were filed, the debris was cleared, and the people who came to rebuild looked at all that newly empty beachfront land and saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. If you're going to build from scratch anyway, why build another cottage when you could build a condominium? 2 brothers from Sycamore, Alabama, had been watching. Gene Brett and his brother Tillis, both military veterans, had teamed up with a builder named Tommy Robinson in 1968 to form Brett Real Estate, later Brett/Robinson, with $500 between them. For over a decade, they'd been working the Gulf Coast, learning the market, selling properties. After Frederic cleared the slate, they saw their moment. In 1982, Brett/Robinson Gulf Corp. was formed, and construction began on Island Winds East in Gulf Shores, one of the first sustained condominium developments on the Alabama coast. The condo era had begun. In 1985, Gene Brett bought a property in Orange Beach where a beach house had recently burned. During an economic downturn, he pooled investors and convinced his partners to build something ambitious on the site. The name came to him in a hotel room while watching the movie The Flight of the Phoenix, a bird that rises from the ashes, stronger than before. That was the story Gene Brett wanted to tell about the Alabama Gulf Coast. Tommy Robinson thought the name was crazy. Gene pushed hard. The Phoenix it was. That name, Phoenix, would become the most recognized brand on the Alabama coastline. Phoenix 1, Phoenix 2, 3, 4, Phoenix West, Phoenix West 2, Phoenix All Suites, Phoenix Gulf Shores. Dozens of buildings, thousands of units, rising along the beachfront in Orange Beach and Gulf Shores like a concrete army marching west from Perdido Pass. Brett/Robinson survived the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s when other developers declared bankruptcy. They survived recessions. They built through every cycle, and the Phoenix name kept multiplying on the skyline. The irony of that name deserves a moment of quiet appreciation. The Phoenix rises from the ashes. It is a symbol of resilience, of rebirth. But the myth never addresses a question that Gulf Shores would eventually have to confront. What if the Phoenix keeps rising and rising and rising until the thing it rises from, the ashes, the emptiness, the clean slate, is the very thing people loved about the place to begin with? Through the 1980s and 1990s, the transformation accelerated. The old Gulf Shores, Beach Boulevard as a two-lane road, cottages among the dunes, a skyline you could see past, was replaced by a new Gulf Shores of concrete towers, swimming pool decks, and an ever-widening commercial strip along Highway 59. The Pink Pony was rebuilt, still pink, still defiantly low-slung, but now it sat in the shadow of buildings that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The population grew from whatever it had been in the 60s and 70s, nobody kept careful count of a place that small, to over 5,000 by the 2000 census, with 2,344 permanent households. More importantly, the summer population surged into the hundreds of thousands. Gulf Shores was no longer a fishing village with a few beach cottages. It was a resort town, and the resort was made of reinforced concrete. The condominiums changed the economics of the place fundamentally. Each unit could be sold to an investor from Atlanta or Nashville or Dallas, who would rent it out through a management company, generating rental income, management fees, and lodging taxes for the city. More units meant more visitors, meant more restaurants and attractions, meant more demand for units. Gulf Shores was not just building condos, it was building a machine. And then on September 16, 2004, the machine was tested again. Hurricane Ivan made landfall just west of Gulf Shores as a Category 3 hurricane, the same classification as Frederic a quarter century earlier. Winds reached 130 miles per hour. The storm surge pushed the ocean more than a mile inland. A data buoy south of Dauphin Island recorded waves 52 feet high. At Gulf State Park, the storm broke the beloved fishing pier into 3 sections and flooded the bottom floors of the old lodge, the gathering place where the Rotary Club met, where weddings were held, where the community came together. It was, as one park official later put it, part of the culture. Ivan effectively ended the old lodge. The building would never reopen. Across Baldwin County and into northwest Florida, the damage reached $14 billion. Satellite images taken 2 days after landfall showed Gulf Shores appearing to have been sandblasted. Tan sand covering buildings, roads, parking lots, structures simply erased. A NASA caption noted, almost as an aside, that not all of the changes are storm-related. A tall new building has been built on the beach near the image center. Even as one hurricane's damage was being photographed from space, the next round of construction was already visible. And once again, the cycle repeated. Ivan destroyed, Gulf Shores rebuilt. The buildings came back taller, stronger, more numerous. Each hurricane was, in effect, an urban renewal project that no city council could have legislated. A forced demolition followed by insurance-funded redevelopment at a higher density and a higher price point. Dennis arrived in 2005, then Katrina. Each storm peeled away another layer of the old Gulf Shores and replaced it with something newer, shinier, and taller. But it was not wind that delivered the next great blow. It was oil. On April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 120 miles southwest of the Alabama coast. 11 workers were killed. For 87 days, crude oil gushed from the Macondo well, nearly 5 million barrels total before it was capped on July 15th. It was the largest oil spill in American history. The oil came ashore on Alabama's beaches in ugly, visceral ways. Tar balls on the white sand, orange booms along the surf line, workers in hazmat gear walking beaches that had been full of children a month earlier. Herb Malone, the CEO of Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism, later described it. Just imagine getting a can of motor oil and you poured it out on the beach. But this was like you poured out a bunch of 55-gallon drums. He said he had never seen as many tears in town. The University of Alabama estimated that a 15% tourism loss and 50% fishing loss would cost the state $1.7 billion in economic output, nearly $500 million in earnings, and roughly 25,000 jobs. The summer season, the season that feeds the entire coastal economy for the year, was functionally canceled. And yet, 24 days after the Deepwater Horizon exploded, a brand new music festival opened on the public beach in Gulf Shores. The Hangout Music Festival had been conceived the previous November by Shaul Zislin and his wife Lily, who owned a beachfront restaurant called The Hangout, and by a promoter named A.J. Nyland. The Gulf Shores City Council approved it in December 2009, even granting a noise ordinance extension so acts could play an hour later than usual. Nobody knew an oil rig was about to blow up. When the spill happened, the festival was already booked, already promoted, already built. Canceling would have been the safe move. They went ahead. 13,000 to 15,000 people showed up each day of that first Hangout Fest in May 2010. It was a modest number, dampened by the national perception that Alabama's beaches were coated in petroleum. But the people who came found what visitors to Gulf Shores have always found when they actually arrive, rather than imagine the worst. White sand, clear water, and a Gulf Coast that was already fighting ferociously to clean itself. By 2011, the festival had to cap attendance at 35,000 per day, an astonishing number for a second-year event, nearly unprecedented in the music festival industry. The estimated economic impact was $30 million. An Auburn University study pegged the 2013 festival at $31 million. Headliners included Stevie Wonder, Tom Petty, the Foo Fighters, the Black Keys. The Hangout Fest put Gulf Shores on a cultural map it had never appeared on before. A rapper named Macklemore, performing at the festival, said something that could serve as the unofficial slogan of modern Gulf Shores. I didn't know that Alabama could look like this. That reaction, the surprise, the disbelief that Alabama has a beach at all, let alone one with sugar-white sand that rivals anything in the Florida Panhandle, has been both Gulf Shores' greatest marketing asset and its deepest vulnerability. For decades, the Alabama coast operated as a kind of open secret, the beach that families from Birmingham, Nashville, Memphis, and Atlanta kept to themselves. The sand really is extraordinary. Fine quartz washed down from the Appalachian Mountains over millennia, bleached white, soft enough to squeak. The water is warm from May through November. Gulf State Park alone encompasses 9 distinct ecosystems and sits on the Mississippi Flyway, a migration route for some 325 bird species. It is, by any honest measure, one of the more remarkable stretches of public coastline in the American South. But remarkable coastline doesn't stay secret in the age of Instagram. And once BP's settlement money arrived, the secret was over. The numbers are worth pausing on because money is what tells the real story of post-spill Gulf Shores. Federal and state trustees allocated $85.5 million in natural resource damage assessment funds to the Gulf State Park Enhancement Project. With additional investment, the total reached roughly $140 million. A new 350-room lodge, designed by Lake Flato architects, LEED Gold certified, the first fortified commercial building in the world, opened in 2018. The old lodge that Ivan had destroyed had been a concrete block motor hotel where the Rotary Club met. The new one was an $85 million sustainability showcase with 40,000 square feet of event space overlooking restored dunes. Environmental groups sued, arguing that BP's settlement money meant for natural resource restoration was being spent on hotel construction. The lawsuit settled, with the state committing $65 million to maintaining public access amenities over 20 years. But the lodge was already built. 28 miles of trails were expanded, 50 acres of dunes restored, an interpretive center and learning campus constructed. The BP money didn't just repair damage from the oil spill. It upgraded Gulf Shore's primary public attraction to a level the city could never have afforded on its own. Here is the darkest irony of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, at least as it played out on the Alabama coast. The oil spill may have been the best thing that ever happened to Gulf Shore's tourism economy. Not because the oil was good, it was devastating, but because the response to it injected capital, attention, and infrastructure into a community that had been growing on its own scrappy terms for decades and suddenly found itself playing in an entirely different league. Before the spill, Gulf Shores was a regional beach town. After the spill money was spent, Gulf Shores was a destination. The tourism numbers tell the story in a straight ascending line. By 2023, 8.4 million visitors came to Baldwin County, with 6.5 million heading specifically to Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, and the Fort Morgan area. Those beach visitors spent $6.7 billion and supported 55,000 tourism-related jobs in a community where the permanent resident population was under 26,000. More than 2 jobs for every man, woman, and child who actually lives there. Lodging revenue climbed from $843 million in 2022 to a record $923 million in 2025, more than doubling in a decade. Retail sales held steady above $1.4 billion. Beth Gendler, president and CEO of Gulf Shores and Orange Beach Tourism, said the same thing at every annual summit. We are a tourism economy here. It is the #1 industry in our county. Nobody was lying. The numbers were real, the growth was real, the money was real. But the numbers described a machine, and the machine was beginning to strain the place it sat on. Highway 59, the main artery connecting Gulf Shores to Interstate 65 and the rest of Alabama, was above traffic capacity during much of the year. Beach Boulevard, the east-west road along the shore, was chronically congested during peak season. The Saturday-to-Saturday rental turnover that most condo management companies enforced meant that every Saturday during the summer, tens of thousands of departing visitors crossed paths with tens of thousands of arriving ones, creating traffic jams that could stretch for miles and last for hours. Visitors on travel forums and review sites described the congestion in Gulf Shores as horrible, capital letters theirs, and increasingly mentioned that they were considering Perdido Key or other less developed alternatives. The buildings kept going up. The old height limits, once roughly 15 stories, were breached. Turquoise Place in Orange Beach rose to 30 stories. The Phoenix West Towers reached 28. Visitors from the northeastern United States, familiar with the overdevelopment of the Jersey Shore and Long Island, posted online with a kind of resigned recognition. It's not so ironic that 3 of the 4 of us who have posted on this thread are from the tri-state area. We all have our own beautiful beaches that have been heavily overdeveloped and hate to see the same thing happening in our place of refuge away from the chaos. One commenter put it more bluntly. The whole area is becoming overdeveloped, but everything is about the bottom line. The condo towers that Brett/Robinson and other developers erected were, in financial terms, a marvel of leverage. Each unit was a revenue-generating asset that paid for itself through vacation rentals, generated management fees, produced lodging tax revenue for the city, and attracted visitors who spent money at restaurants, attractions, and shops. The city's own budget depended on that tax revenue. Tourism wasn't just the #1 industry. It was, for practical purposes, the only industry. Gulf Shores had no manufacturing base, no corporate headquarters, no university, no military installation. It had sand and sunshine, and a machine that converted sand and sunshine into money. But machines need feeding. Between 2000 and 2020, the permanent population of Gulf Shores tripled, from just over 5,000 to more than 15,000. The city formed its own school system in 2019. Medical facilities were needed. The Vision 2025 plan, adopted in 2014, explicitly acknowledged that Gulf Shores' economy was dangerously undiversified. Mayor Robert Kraft said the oil spill had driven home the lack of economic diversity and the weaknesses in our economy. The plan asked, "What's not here that needs to be here?" Good questions. But the answer in practice was mostly more condos. By 2022, the city's assistant administrator, Lee Jones, was presenting numbers to the city council that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. Gulf Shores had 1,806 acres of undeveloped property. Based on existing zoning entitlements, those properties could yield approximately 23,000 new units, nearly double the number of units of any type that currently existed in the city. If those entitlements were built out, Jones said, every major roadway in our community would be above capacity and would be in a deficient state. The city enacted a 6-month moratorium on townhouse and multifamily site plans while it amended its zoning ordinance. The moratorium expired, development resumed, the numbers kept climbing. 1,000 new rental units were added in the 18 months before mid-2024. Another 1,000 were expected over the following 3 years. Each new unit added available room nights. 365,000 additional room nights per year from just the first batch, which meant more visitors, more traffic, more strain. The growth was not organic in the way that a city grows when people move there for jobs and schools and community. The growth was driven by investment capital seeking returns through vacation rentals. Many of the new condo owners didn't live in Gulf Shores. They lived in Birmingham or Huntsville or Atlanta and visited their units a few weeks a year. The rest of the time, the units were inventory in a rental machine. The city's motto, adopted somewhere along the way with the kind of cheerful obliviousness that municipal marketing departments specialize in, was small town, big beach. By 2025, it was hard to argue that either half of the motto was accurate. The town wasn't small. It had 15,000 permanent residents, over 60,000 tourism-related jobs in the immediate area, and 6.5 million annual visitors. And the beach, while still geologically magnificent, was increasingly crowded, increasingly shadowed by towers, and increasingly difficult to reach without sitting in traffic. The development moratorium that the City Council passed in March 2026 was not the first such pause. There had been a 6-month freeze in 2022, but it was the most sweeping. For 12 months, the city would not accept new applications for planned unit developments, conditional use permits for multifamily or townhouse construction, major subdivisions, or certain rezonings. The city would use the time to develop a comprehensive 20-year plan covering land use, housing, urban design, multimodal mobility, environmental resilience, and economic development. Gulf Shores was not alone. Orange Beach had extended its own moratoriums by 9 months. Foley, the inland city that serves as the commercial gateway to the coast, had paused certain residential development. Robertsdale, further north, enacted a 6-month moratorium. Fairhope, across Mobile Bay, extended its freeze for the second time. Daphne began discussing its own pause on multifamily projects. Across Baldwin County, the fastest-growing county in one of the fastest-growing regions of the United States, city after city was reaching the same conclusion. The growth had gotten ahead of the infrastructure, and somebody needed to slow down long enough to think. The deeper question, the one that no moratorium can answer, is what Gulf Shores wants to be when it grows up. The city was nothing, and then it was a fishing village, and then it was a cottage beach, and then a hurricane erased all of that, and it became a condo beach. And then an oil spill poured money into it, and it became a destination resort. Each transformation was driven not by a community making a deliberate choice, but by an external event, a storm, a spill, a wave of capital that reshaped the place according to its own logic. The people who remember old Gulf shores, and they are fewer every year, remember something specific. They remember the dunes. Before Frederic, the beach was fronted by natural sand dunes that rose and fell with the seasons, anchored by sea oats and morning glories. The cottages sat behind the dunes, not on top of them. You walked over the dunes to get to the water, and when you stood on the beach looking back, you saw sand and vegetation and maybe the peak of a cottage roof. The dunes were the boundary between the human world and the Gulf. They were also the beach's natural defense against storm surge, a flexible, self-healing barrier that absorbed wave energy and rebuilt itself. The condos were built where the dunes had been. Concrete doesn't flex. Concrete doesn't rebuild itself after a storm. Concrete requires beach renourishment projects, multi-million-dollar pumping operations that dredge sand from offshore and spray it back onto the beach, only to watch the next winter's storms carry it away again. The city completed one such project recently. When a winter storm hit shortly afterward and began peeling the new sand away, a city spokesman said, with the weary optimism of a man who has said this before, "We have not wasted money. It is a little bit scary and nerve-wracking now, but hopefully the storm passes and we will see this regeneration soon." The emergency management coordinator added, "Just know that we are going to lose some of the beach during the winter storms. But Mother Nature has a way of putting it back in the months of April and May." Mother Nature does put it back, but Mother Nature also sends Category 3 hurricanes to this stretch of coast with a regularity that would make an actuary flinch. Gulf Shores has taken direct or near-direct hits from major hurricanes in 1926, 1979, 2004, and 2020. Hurricane Sally, which made landfall nearby as a Category 2 with a devastating, slow-moving rain event. The insurance math alone is enough to give a property investor pause. Flood insurance premiums in coastal Baldwin County have risen sharply under FEMA's Risk Rating 2.0 methodology. And the cost of wind and storm coverage has climbed to the point where some property owners have begun to self-insure, which is a polite way of saying they pray. The Hangout Music Festival, the event that arguably did more than anything else to put Gulf Shores on the national cultural map, found itself in an uncertain position by 2025. The festival's agreement with the city had not been renewed after its 10th anniversary event that year. A local news outlet ran a story under the headline, "15 Years of Hangout Festivals. Will Gulf Shores Stop the Music?" The festival had generated tens of millions of dollars annually for the local economy, filled hotels during a traditionally quiet shoulder season, and attracted national media coverage that no amount of paid advertising could have replicated. But festivals bring noise, traffic, crowds, and the general chaos of 40,000 young people on a beach, and the residents who had moved to Gulf Shores for its small-town feel were not universally enthusiastic. Morgan Wallen's Sand in My Boots Festival made its debut in 2025 with an estimated $70 million economic impact, but local reports indicated it would not return in 2026. The city was surveying residents about their tolerance for large events. The very attractions that had made Gulf Shores famous were now the subject of community debate, not because they had failed, but because they had succeeded too well. This is the particular trap that Gulf Shores has built for itself, and it is a trap that has no obvious exit. The city's entire fiscal structure depends on tourism revenue. Without visitors, there are no lodging taxes, no retail sales taxes, no restaurant taxes, no jobs. The city cannot afford to discourage tourism. But the tourism, at the scale it has reached, is degrading the qualities that attract tourists in the first place. The white sand is still there, but you reach it after sitting in traffic on Highway 59 for an hour. The water is still warm, but the beach in front of the big towers is packed shoulder to shoulder in July. The seafood is still fresh, but the restaurants are chains now as often as they are local joints. The sunset is still beautiful, but you watch it from the 22nd floor balcony of a Phoenix tower, looking down at a beach that no longer resembles the one in the postcards from the 1960s. Herb Malone, the tourism CEO, once said that he still gets puzzled looks when he uses the words Alabama and beach in the same sentence. The national perception of Alabama does not naturally include white sand and emerald water. That perception gap was for decades Gulf Shore's secret weapon. People didn't come because they didn't know, and the people who did know had the place largely to themselves. The perception gap is closing. 6.5 million visitors a year means the secret is out. And when the secret is out, what replaces it is not discovery, but management, crowd management, traffic management, growth management, expectation management. The place that was once defined by its emptiness is now defined by its fullness. The Pink Pony Pub is still there, still pink, still low-slung, still serving oysters and burgers 100 feet from the surf, as it has since 1956. Its website says it has survived hurricanes, condo booms, and the ever-changing shoreline. It is, by any measure, one of the last vestiges of old Gulf shores. The Gulf shores of cottages and dunes and 120 residents. A writer for an Alabama sports blog called it everything a divey little beach bar should be, and noted that everyone raised in Alabama probably has a childhood memory of sprinting across those scorching white sands, up the ramp, and into its dark, dim embrace. But the Pink Pony now sits among towers that would have been science fiction when Mary Bell Mernick painted the first building pink. The view from its deck includes concrete and glass where there used to be sand and sky. On Friday nights, bands still play Sweet Home Alabama as long and often as anyone wants to hear it, and people still dance on the slim dance floor, and the smell of oysters on the half-shell still mixes with the salt air. But when you walk out the door and look up, the skyline belongs to the Phoenix. Jean Brett's mythical bird, the one that rises from the ashes, has risen so many times now that the ashes themselves are buried under concrete. The question for Gulf Shores is whether there is anything left to rise from, or whether the rising itself has become the problem. A city built on sand, rebuilt after storms, rebuilt again after oil, rebuilt again after each wave of capital, is now trying to figure out, for the first time in its history, whether it might want to stop rebuilding for a moment and decide what it actually is. The moratorium runs 12 months. The Council can extend it twice, 6 months each time. The comprehensive plan will address land use, housing, urban design, mobility, environmental resilience, and economic development. The full vocabulary of a city that has finally noticed it is no longer a small town on a big beach, but something else entirely. Something with 55,000 jobs and 6.5 million visitors and record lodging revenue and roads above capacity and sand that has to be pumped back onto the beach because the dunes that used to hold it are buried under the foundations of 22-story condominium towers named after a bird that symbolizes rebirth. The Gulf is still out there, warm and green and ancient. The same water that washed over this sand before anyone thought to count the residents or name the town. The sand is still white. The shrimp still come in season. On a quiet Wednesday morning in February, before the spring breakers arrive and the rental turnover Saturdays begin, you can stand on the beach near the Pink Pony and hear the surf and see the pelicans and feel for a moment what 120 people felt in 1956. That this particular stretch of coast is something rare, something worth keeping. Then a truck from the Beach Renourishment Project rumbles past, and a family from Nashville checks into a 22nd floor unit they booked through an app, and the traffic on Highway 59 begins its slow crawl toward the water, and the machine starts up again for another day.